In today's video, we're going to be breaking down PetiteKnit's Novice Sweater. We're going to be putting it head to head with the free drops alternative. By the end of this video, you'll have a clear sense of which pattern is easier to follow and if the Novice Sweater really lives up to its name. Let's dive in. My name is Gabriella and welcome to Pure Light Fiber. And thanks so much for tuning in today. In today's video, we're going to be going over PetiteKnit's Novice Sweater and breaking down what's actually happening in those sample pictures. I'll compare step by step with a free drops alternative and we'll see which one is actually beginner friendly. We're going to be comparing these two sweaters based on three factors. So firstly, the cost factor. How much is the pattern, including the recommended yarn? What's the difference there? Then we'll be going over the instructions. So how is the respective writing style of the pattern? Is it clear? Is it unclear? What are the differences? And thirdly, we're going to be going over construction and the techniques used. And that's where it's going to be getting interesting for the novice sweater. But first, let's take a closer look at each sweater's details. So I have my notes down here as usual. I'll be looking down every now and then. So the novice sweater has a 16 stitch gauge and is worked on 6mm needles, whereas the caramel haze sweater has a 21 stitch gauge and is worked on 4mm needles. So both of these patterns are a circular yoke pattern. There's no shaping involved, so no short row shaping or anything like that. And the differences, as I mentioned, are the gauge. And if you see the ribbing on PetiteKnit's sweater is a little bit longer than on the drop sweater. As well, the drop sweater has kind of a tapered sleeve, whereas PetiteKnit's novice sweater doesn't have any decreases, no shaping on the arm. However, right before you start the ribbing, she has one round of rapid decreases, so it kind of gives a balloony effect to the sleeve. Other than that, you'll see the neck is a little bit different. So on PetiteKnit's version, she has kind of a longer neck, which she has instructions for folding it down or leaving it high like a faux mock neck. So right off the bat, we can see that both of these sweaters are your standard run-of-the-mill, typical circular yoke patterns. There's no shaping involved. No German short rows, no waist shaping, nothing like that. So super plain, super simple. So let's see how much each sweater costs. So you may be wondering, why is it important to know how much each sweater costs with a recommended yarn? So these are both beginner-friendly patterns, especially PetiteKnit's Novice Sweater is, often touted as being the non plus ultra ultimate beginner-friendly pattern. I mean, as the name suggests, it's called the Novice Sweater. So obviously a lot of beginners are knitting this sweater. And, as a beginner, at least for me, I was definitely not confident swapping out recommended yarns. I would have much preferred just to stick with the recommended yarn because I did not feel confident going to look for alternatives. That's why I think, especially for beginners, they typically tend to knit according to the recommended yarn. It doesn't matter what that yarn is. They may be a little bit scared that if they swap to a wrong yarn or they can't pick the right yarn, that their outcome will be completely different as in the pictures. So that's why I think, looking at the costs of your first sweater overall, not just the knitting pattern, but also the yarn costs, the total cost of making this sweater is going to be really important in this exercise. So for both of these sweaters, we're going to be looking at the recommended yarn for the size large. So let's start with PetiteKnit's Novice Sweater. So first of all, we have the cost of the sweater. It's 50 Danish krone, and that translates to, at this time, €6.70. Then PetiteKnit also gives 3 suggestions for the recommended yarn. So first, she has the Kamarose Snefnug, and for the size large, you would need 450 grams, which is 9 balls of the Snefnug, and each ball retails for €9.90. So all in all, you'll be paying €89.10 for the yarn, plus the pattern costs, so total €95.80. The second suggestion is 350 grams of Sudnesgarn Kås, 7 balls of the Kås. Each ball costs €12.60. So all in all, the yarn is going to be costing you €88.20 with the pattern that's coming out to be €94.80. The third suggestion is the most pricey one. So for suggestion 3, she recommends 400 grams of Isager Jensen yarn, which retails for €9.50 per 50 gram. ball, and you need 400 grams, so that's 76 euro right there. And you need to hold it with a silk mohair, so 125 gram of that. Each ball comes at 25 grams, so times 11 euro per 25 gram ball, that's another 55 euro. All in all, the cost will be 131 for the yarn, plus the pattern, it's 137.70 cents. So, 137 euros and 70 cents, pretty steep in my opinion for your first sweater project. Now let's compare this to the recommended yarn that the Drops Caramel Haze suggests for the large size. So right off the bat, we have the free pattern here, and Drops recommends 2 different yarns. So first recommendation is to use Drops Sky, and you would need 400 grams of this. It retails for €5.40 each. So all in all, the yarn will cost you, and this project actually will cost you, 43 euros and 20 cents. And the second recommendation they have is using Drops Daisy instead. You would need 700 grams of that, and each ball is 50-gram ball, retailing for 3 euros and 57 cents. So all in all, that would total 52 euro and 50 cents. So you can see here, that the Drops recommended yarn is depends on which suggestion from for the novice sweater that you're comparing it to, but you could say it's half or less. So right off the bat here, we see a huge difference in the cost factor if you're going to be going with the Drops pattern and the recommended yarn, or the novice sweater and the recommended yarn. So now let's check out the pattern writing style. So I think by now everybody knows that PetiteKnit's pattern writing style is super detailed. And most of her patterns are really detailed, and for the novice sweater, I think that's even more so. So she definitely makes more of a point to explain every single step as if you know absolutely nothing. I was looking at the word count as well, and PetiteKnit's novice sweater clocks in at 2,200 words, whereas the Drops pattern is 1,300 words long. So here you can tell PetiteKnit really spells out every step. She's really holding your hand through the whole process. I really want to emphasize how much she holds your hand when going through the pattern. And her pattern writing style is really cheerleader-like, because she really gets that you are a beginner, you know nothing basically when you purchase this pattern and you want to make this pattern. So she's really picking the people up emotionally where they are. She understands that, this is a massive undertaking for somebody who's never done this before. And she really can emphasize with the knitter at this point. So again, the whole pattern clearly acknowledges the newbie status of the knitter, and she's really sympathizing with the knitter the whole way through. So that's why I would say PetiteKnit's patterns are super mindless. You really don't have to be thinking while you're making her patterns. Just read the instructions and do what she says, but otherwise, everything is done for you. So with Drops pattern, I would say that's not quite true. Like you do have to think a little bit, not too much, but definitely activate those brain cells a little bit, so your brain cannot be completely shut off when you're knitting a Drops pattern, at least for the yoke part. But I do think that the extra thought that you have to have when following a Drops pattern actually will make you a better knitter faster. So an example of this in the Drops pattern is when they explain when to do the increases on the yoke section. So instead of spelling out exactly how many stitches are between each increase for the yoke section, they basically tell you, like, look, punch into this calculator here how many stitches you have on the needle, and we'll tell you how many stitches between each increase there needs to be. So again, not hard. I mean, they do provide the little calculator on their website, and I'll show it right here. But again, PetiteKnit's pattern is really like, do the increase after X amount of stitches each row or every 4th row or whatever. And with Drops pattern, you don't have that. So you just have to think a little bit extra. They also have a little chart down below that shows you when you need to increase for the size that you're knitting. So where Drops offers a schematic, PetiteKnit's does not. Both of the patterns, however, have video tutorials for each technique used in the pattern. So if you go to the Drops website, you'll see a little section just like on the PetiteKnit website where it says videos. Click on that, and then you'll see a video for each technique used in the pattern. And the same thing goes for PetiteKnit. And also good to know for you guys is that both on PetiteKnit's website as well as the Drops website, those video tutorials are free for anybody. So you don't have to be purchasing a pattern or downloading a pattern or anything. So another example of this would be where drops just tells you to cast on new stitches for the underarm. Usually you do this using a backward loop technique or something like that. So drops does not give you the special technique to it. PetiteKnit doesn't either. However, you can see in one of her video tutorials on her website what technique that she used. So she does use that backward loop technique. So lastly, let's look at the techniques used. This is where it gets interesting. So where drops just tells you to cast on, doesn't give you a specific method. But from the pictures, I would say, you know, it's just your standard, maybe German twisted cast on or a long tail cast on. But the drops picture doesn't really focus in on the neckline. So you just have pictures from afar, but they're not really zooming in and making it a point to show you how the ribbing or how the neckband is made. It's not a major selling point. And also the ribbing is just a simple 1x1 ribbing, and the bind off technique that they show in those video tutorials is also just, you know, your standard 1x1 bound off technique. These are not advanced cast on or bind off techniques in my opinion. Now let's look at the novice sweater. So just like the drops pattern, PetiteKnit does not specify a method of casting on. She simply says in the pattern, cast on using your preferred technique. And if you go to the video tutorials, they also do not show you at all how to cast on. So this wouldn't be a problem in itself. However, since this pattern is written for the ultra beginner, I would say that the sample pictures have to match those ultra beginner techniques as well. You'll see in the pictures on the novice sweater that the cast on is not your typical cast on. You can see by the neck edge, this is, you know, this is not a long tail cast on or anything like that. This appears to be a tubular cast on or something way more advanced than, you know, your standard run-of-the-mill long tail cast on. So it looks like a tubular cast on in my eyes, and I just think that this is kind of misleading because this is an advanced technique used for a sample picture for an ultra beginner pattern. So right off the bat, if you're purchasing the novice sweater and you expect to have your cast on edge looking like the sample pictures, unfortunately you're going to be disappointed because there's no instructions. You know, obviously this is a beginner pattern, you're not going to have the tubular cast on in there. So right there, you're not going to be able to finish the sweater with the same finishings and the same techniques that PetiteKnit used for her sample pictures. So we see the same thing happening with the bind off. And again, I wouldn't say this is a problem, but just, you know, this is a beginner pattern and I would expect the sample pictures to reflect the techniques used in the pattern, because otherwise it's kind of misleading. You know, if you're using a tubular cast off for the novice sweater, you know, trying to make the finishings look better than the pattern is written, then, you know, I think this is just misleading. So in PetiteKnit's pattern, she just says to bind off, and then in the videos on PetiteKnit's website, you'll see the bind off is a standard 1x1 rib. So the video tutorial just shows you a standard 1x1 rib bind off and not a tubular bind off as you see in those sample pictures. So again, for a beginner, you know, they're probably going to be knitting the sweater, binding off according to what's directed for them in those videos and seeing like, hey, this is not turning out like in the sample pictures, and then they probably just think like, oh, I guess, you know, my skills are obviously not as advanced as PetiteKnit's or anybody who's knit this sample, so yeah, I guess I'll get better over time, not realizing that it's a different technique completely. Also, there probably were some beginners out there that picked the novice sweater exactly for these finishings because it stood out compared to, you know, your typical beginner pattern that would also only have that 1x1 ribbed bind off and a long tail cast on or something like that. So, you know, it is a little bit misleading that the techniques used are not going to be reflected in the pattern. So lastly, as well, there's a little bit of murkiness going on, in my opinion, in the way that the ribbing is described. So for the ribbing in the sample pictures, it's a twisted rib. You can clearly see that. The main pattern instructions just says knit one, purl one, and then she has a little tip as a side note if you want it to look like in the pictures, purl one and knit one through the back loop. But she only has this side note in the neck ribbing. This side note is not repeated for the sleeves or the body ribbing. So again, if you're just a beginner, and you don't really care about those the same finishes that she has in those sample pictures, I would say, go for it. Knit the pattern. She really holds your hand through the whole process. You won't get lost. You probably won't get lost at all. But if you're looking for those polished finishes that really sold the pattern for you in the first place, I would say, stay away, because you're going to be disappointed. You're not going to be getting what you hoped for. So then with the drops, although I think, drops patterns are great, they're free, they're freely available. You can read through the pattern before you jump into the project and see, if it makes sense to you or not, which unfortunately, with those paid patterns, there's a paywall in front of you, so you can't just, skim the pattern and see if it makes sense to you first. And although I think that in the long term, you're going to be benefiting much more, like your knitting skills will get so much better, much faster if you're knitting patterns like drops. Maybe for your absolute first sweater pattern, probably don't knit a drops, but you can definitely do that as, your second or third pattern. I've knit a lot of drops before. I never had a problem with it. So the question now is, what should you do and which pattern to choose? So, in my opinion, I would not knit either. I wouldn't recommend either patterns for a complete beginner. What I do recommend, however, is following a video tutorial. So there's tons of amazing sweater pattern tutorials on YouTube. Just Google it and you'll be hit with a lot of free tutorials that really show you visually, step by step, each step that you need to do to achieve, your finished garment. So I'll link some of these great patterns down below. Again, these are free tutorials and free patterns. I'll link some down below, and my favorite one I'll link up here. But again, if you're looking for a beginner-friendly sweater pattern, I would start on YouTube and use step-by-step video instructions to do so first. So to summarize, let's go over those 3 techniques that you need to swap out and know before you cast on for your novice sweater. First of all, you'll need to do the tubular cast on. Second of all, you'll need to do twisted rib for the ribbing. And third of all, you'll need to do the tubular cast off. So there are plenty of video tutorials on YouTube on how to do those 3 techniques. And I would call these 3 techniques pretty advanced. I mean, the twisted rib is pretty okay, but the tubular cast on especially and cast off can be a little tricky. I mean, definitely not as easy as your standard long tail cast on. So that's it for me. What do you think? Are you as surprised as I was when I found this out? I thought this video was just going to be the novice sweater versus a free drops alternative, and what I was going to do is just compare the specs and the pattern writing style. But again, when I took a closer look at the novice sweater, I felt it was quite dishonest if I didn't mention those findings to you. So again, I'm not trying to be mean to anyone or shame anybody, but I really think that we should be honest as a community when we find this kind of stuff out, so we can do better. So that's a wrap from me, and give it a like if you learned something from this video, and please subscribe to my channel if you want to see more such videos in the future. I post videos every week and I would love to have you around. Thanks so much for joining me. Bye.